Hello friends, and welcome to another spring days vlog wherein it's continuing to rain in my part of England. But it is the sort of rain that I do love the sound of. The kitchen is a cozy place that I like to take refuge in during days like this. And today's video, I'm just going to be sharing with you several comfort food recipes that my family absolutely love. To start off with, we have some bacon ribs that I picked up from Costco. The difference between bacon ribs and pork ribs is that bacon ribs are basically cured in the same way that bacon is, so they tend to be a little bit on the saltier side. Price-wise, they are similar priced, although my own personal preference would be the pork ribs, but in this particular occasion, Costco didn't have the pork ribs. This is a family favorite meal that even the children would eat when they were younger, and I think even the most fussiest of eaters would love ribs because there's something very satisfying about eating the meat falling off of the bones. So the first thing to do is to remove the membrane that is at the base of the ribs, and that membrane, if not removed, no matter how long you cook the ribs for, the ribs will be tough and not at all tender. So we remove that and then it's ready to go. Since these ribs are quite salty, one of the best ways to go forward is to actually bring them to the boil for about half an hour in a saucepan, pour the water out, and then put in some fresh water, then restart the cooking process of boiling them. I prefer to stack my ribs standing up like this in the saucepan. Number one, because it means that you don't have the situation of have the bottommost rib being overcooked whilst everything else isn't quite as cooked. This way everything is evenly cooked. It does mean that I can't have the extra long racks. That's something that my children complain about, but we have to make do with what we have. After the first boil, I'll move it into the Instant Pot and put it on slow cooker.
Hello, it's another lovely rainy day here in England. I must say, we really do excel at rainy spring days. Yeah, almost second day in a row now. The good thing is I don't have to worry about watering the vegetables as much. Um, yeah, and I'll leave it at there. I just have a few errands to run at Aldi. I need to pick up some more things to bake some cakes and to make some cornbread, but it's like a lot of it's a cooking heavy session today. I can't do that much outside the garden, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to get in to do some sewing in my sewing room because it's been a while.
The plot twist is that I didn't manage to get into the sewing room. However, I did manage to bake something from one of my daughter's baking books. I decided to make some caramel pecan cupcakes for the family because we had some pecans and we had some condensed milk that we could use to make into caramel, and I thought it would be a nice treat to add on to the comfort food theme that I basically ended up picking up on this rainy day. So for this recipe, I'm trying out using some egg powder. So this is free range whole egg powder, and the recipe requires 3 eggs. So I'm going to make up 3 eggs worth of egg powder, and then I'm going to add it to the butter and the sugar and mix it. So this is the first time that I'm using the egg powder, so we'll see how this works out. I found that the egg powder had a very similar texture to cornstarch, except it wasn't quite as smooth as cornstarch, but it has a similar clumping habit like cornstarch. Before the full egg powder, I was using egg white powder, which I have because of my keto things that I make, and I think egg white powder handles a lot easier than the full egg powder. But I went on with it, and I'm definitely going to be using more of it. I think it did reasonably well. I did read later on that it's probably better to use warm water when you're reconstituting the egg. And in this particular instance, I used cold water, and it does get very lumpy, but I counted on using the whisk to be able to get rid of as many of the lumps as is possible. So once all of my ingredients were together, I love to use the mise en place method where everything is put together before we then start mixing. So I have the butter and the brown sugar, and that's just beating it until it is quite light and creamy, and then adding the eggs. And as you can see there, they're really quite lumpy. It didn't detract too much from the end result, but it did look a bit horrible before I added the flour. But then after I added the flour, the butter normalized and it looked like normal butter. But definitely in the future, I will be using warm water to reconstitute the eggs. But we got there in the end. To make sure that I have an even amount in each cupcake, I like to use the ice cream scoop. That makes everything a lot more even. These then go into the oven at 180 degrees fan assisted, and they're supposed to be in for about 20 minutes or so. And I normally like to shave 3 minutes off of a 20-minute cooking time because I find that my oven tends to run hot. So that's something that I've learned over the years. Moving on, the next thing to go with the ribs that I will be making is some cornbread muffins, and we've been making and using this recipe for years now. I use tinned sweet corn for that, and my secret ingredient is soured cream to make it really thick and luxurious. So first of all, drain the water from the sweet corn, and we're trying to make some creamed sweet corn. And I do this by using my hand blender to just basically blitz them and create like a sweet corn porridge, so to speak. The recipe also calls for 3 eggs, and you need some flour as well as some polenta. I use milli meal, which I think is very similar to polenta, and this milli meal is something that I use to make a traditional to my culture food called sadza, and it works just as well. And in the meantime, the oven pinged and the cupcakes were ready to come out. So back to the cornbread, I then mix the flour with the sugar and the polenta. So that's all of the dried ingredients. And then I add in the melted butter. So you have to use melted butter, which I think just gives it a lovely moistness to it. And then I'm just going to mix that in. And then the next thing to add in will be the eggs. So it's not a good idea to add in the eggs and the butter at the same time, because when you melt the butter, it's a little bit warm, and if it's too warm, it will cook the eggs. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But once everything has been mixed together, we then add the creamed sweet corn, and you can make this as chunky as you want to or not. So I tend to prefer to not be able to see actual full-on sweet corn, but if you wanted that in your cornbread, you can do that. I've done it before, but it's just a personal preference. And then I'm just going to add in the sour cream. You can use buttermilk for this if you want to, or yogurt, or just straight up milk. If you do use milk, it will need a little bit longer to cook because it becomes a more watery batter, if that makes sense. So I just mix all of that together, and then I will put it into my prepared tin with some greaseproof paper, or you can grease it with some butter and flour, and that's going to go into the oven at 160 degrees. So after I took the cupcakes out, I turned the temperature down to 160 degrees because it needs to cook low and slow, and if you cook it too fast it becomes a little bit stodgy and quite not optimal. To me, it's optimal when it isn't stodgy. So that goes in there for about 30 minutes. That ought to be enough to get it done. After about 10 minutes in the baking tin, the cupcakes are ready to be moved onto the cooling rack. The next thing that I need to do for the cupcakes is to prepare the pecans. I prefer to toast them before crushing them and adding them on as decoration. I think that it adds a lovely crunch to it when it's done that way. And whilst those are going for about 10 minutes, I'm going to start on the caramel. So I'm using the condensed milk method, wherein I will add caramel to some butter and golden syrup, as well as a little bit of granulated sugar. And I'll just put this on heat, medium heat to high heat for the first 5 minutes or so until it gets to boiling, and then bring it back down, and then just keep on stirring the entire time so that it doesn't scorch at the bottom, because condensed milk is milk and it will have a tendency to scorch, and so it's just constantly stirring it. And I used a half a tin of condensed milk, otherwise it would have made way too much caramel. And even with using a half a tin of condensed milk, we still had loads of leftover caramel. Mind you, the kids were not complaining at all. So I need the caramel to have cooled down before it's used on the cupcakes, because there's going to be some buttercream frosting that's going to go onto the cupcakes. The cornbread is out of the oven and it's looking good now. The rain continued. Everything looks verdant and green and very lush regardless, which is always a lovely thing. Once I have the pecans out of the oven, I use my tamper instrument here to crush them, and that's just to have some nice sort of chunky little bits. I made the buttercream frosting, and I do apologize, I thought I was actually recording but it turns out my phone had run out of battery. So I decided to do a bit of an orange coloring on the buttercream frosting, and then I prepared the piping bags. By this time it was nearly school run time and my daughters were going to be back from school, and I thought it would be a lovely treat for them to get to decorate the cupcakes. They love doing that sort of thing, and so I set up everything, the piping bags, using the greaseproof paper, and used the noisettes, and then everything was ready for them to go as soon as they go back from school, and they had a lot of fun doing it. Once the cupcakes were done, it was time to go back to the bacon ribs, which at this point had been slow cooking away in the Instant Pot for nearly 3 hours. They were gorgeously cooked and the meat was falling off the bone. I made a barbecue sauce, which I'll link in the description down below. It's a very simple one that uses barbecue sauce as a base, and then I add some apple cider vinegar, some white rice wine vinegar, and some, for the sourness, I add some mustard, and I mix it in with some honey. And then I use my pastry brush and I just make sure I slather it all over the bottom and the tops of the ribs in a Pyrex dish. They're going to get broiled, so I have the oven going up to temperature right now so that they will be able to get broiled, and that will really bring out the stickiness of the ribs. Our favorite size to go with it is some tender stem broccoli or purple sprouting broccoli, and then I also have some regular broccoli that I have just chopped up and added some butter to it, and that's going to be for me. I love buttered broccoli. And this is what they look like once they have been broiled. And I put the cornbread back into the oven to get it nice and warm in time for serving. And these are so gorgeous. They are melt in your mouth. They're delightfully sticky. This is comfort food at its best. This is food that reassures you that everything is going to be fine, as long as there's some good food like this around to be had and to be enjoyed. And it's a fantastic family meal that everybody really likes. We get our hands dirty and quite sticky. There is no way to eat this food in a very elegant etiquette-like manner. This is very much hands-on food. Thank you so much for joining along with us on this rainy day where we've just been focusing on the food adventures. And until I see you next time, friends, I wish you blue skies, health, and happiness. Bye.